What would Swedenborg think of all this? Well, I'll find out when I read. But anyway, so there are many kinds of imaginary territories. But what about the highway? Well, the highway is another property of the imaginary territories. Well, at least with my imaginary territory, the east side. Well, and that is assumed to be the largest imaginary territory because it's the one that is the fairest and the one that is the most honest and treats people the way they should be treated, the way you want to be treated. So everything's kind of fair and open. Over on the west side, things, well, a deception is allowed, and people are allowed to put up fronts and pretend there's something they're not, or pretend there's someone who they're not. So, in other words, a poor person could pretend to be rich on the west side and everything's hunky dory and fine with that. Where on the east side, they would be frowned upon. And if their behavior persisted even for an instant, they would be transferred over to the west side, in a sense. And once their behavior shifted back, they would be transferred to the east side. And of course, if they're wavering too much, they would be stuck in the central region. And as I said, some people shift quite a bit and other people's don't, depending on their attitudes. Well, on the east side, well, the east side likes more members. It's the largest imaginary territory, and I guess it wants to be even larger, dragging more people into its merriment, into its love, into its excitement, and all that. Well, gee, ain't it all wonderful? Sure, I feel it often. But what I haven't told you all about is the highway. The highway that leads to the imaginary territory, or perhaps more specifically, the highway of the imaginary territory. Well, the East Side Highway, that is. The highway associated with the East Side. Of course, I'm from the Northeast Side, being a little extroverted and willing to talk about such things. So it would be the Northeastern Interstate Highway, is what the original name of it was, conceived by me. Of course, it might not be a highway. It could be a road. It could be a river or a path. In theory, it might be depicted in by ancient statues. The statues would be under the highway and would be pillars of the highway, i.e., we would have human pillars of this highway. Well, I guess I'm referring to a bridge on the highway, where the columns of the bridge, the pillars of the bridge, would be human, and on their hand, the highway would rest. Well, I guess that's the way it would be depicted in my mind. Anyway, the people holding up the highway couldn't be more proud to do so. They don't think themselves of slaves. No, they're doing something very important. They're guiding more people to the imaginary territory that they belong to. The more the merrier. People travel over them, and they couldn't be more excited by it. Sure, they love people traveling over them, going to the imaginary territory associated with them, and they like to draw people to their imaginary territories. And I guess by them drawing people to it, that in a sense would be the highway, would in a sense be the draw of it. I guess it might seem a little confusing. Gee, I guess this is all a little esoteric. Well, I guess it is because I'm the only one who has thought of it. Or have I? Well, anyway, I'll find that out in the future. Anyway, so we have this highway or this mechanism of drawing people to the imaginary territories where our individual lives, us as individuals, help draw more people to it too. Remember, what happens in the imaginary territories corresponds to what happens in our lives. So just like we could draw people into our thinking, so can beings in the imaginary territories draw more beings into the imaginary territories. We, in our individual lives, affect the imaginary territories, and the imaginary territories, affect us. And they operate on similar principles, at least as far as the shifting sands of attitudes and morals. So, in other words, imaginary territories change with us as we change. And as they change, we change. And as we change, they change. Does Schwarty believe in this? Well, I'll find out in the future. That's why I'm going over these critical properties of the imaginary territories with you in advance so you could verify as a viewer, and I could verify in a sense, but anyway, that they are separate. And perhaps I'll learn and adopt from reading about Sufism and what they think of the imaginary territories that might adopt my perspective on mine. Sure, but before it gets affected by Sufism, it's important to let these important properties be known. Anyway, so we have the shifting sands and how we affect one another. The imaginary territories affect us and we affect them. Anyway, so we have, as I said, we have the highway and a way of drawing people into the imaginary territories. But there's other properties too. Well, on the east side, we love to do things together. We always think of ourselves functioning in a group with several, if not many, people or imaginary territory beings or both working with us on any given moral quest. Even though it might seem impossible, somehow, even people we don't know or interact with, perhaps they somehow affect us in all of this. And perhaps we affect them by having similar desires. So that's another property of the imaginary territories, is we could affect each other at a distance without even knowing it, just by having similar goals and attitudes. Sure, I believe in this quite strongly. And so that's why I typically think of myself not functioning alone in the imaginary territories or in any moral quest, but rather having lots of friends and agents working with me. Casey Waters Show. Producer Casey Waters. Graphic editing Judson Laird. Please note our new email address, CaseyWaters2 at CaseyWaters.com.